You grow up here and God loves you, and then you realize that, the people that say that have their fingers crossed behind their back, or they put an asterisk beside it. And being around AWAB Baptists, that love was put out there in an unconditional way.
I'm Brian Henderson, Executive Director of the Association of Welcoming and Affirming Baptists, or AWAB. Our mission is to create and support a community of churches, organizations, and individuals committed to the inclusion of LGBTQ plus persons in the full life and mission of the Baptist landscape. In this first season of the AWAB podcast, Voice of the Turtle, we're going to dig into the past while we face the present. The year 2026 brings some uncertainty for our LGBTQ plus siblings and allies. But we've been here before. Across 8 episodes, we're going to burrow our way through some of our history and talk to the people who made it and are still making it. In this episode, you'll hear from the Reverend Junia Joplin. Junia lives and serves as an associate pastor in Toronto, Canada. Though her roots are in the United States, her years of ministry have unfolded in Canada. We'll spend some time discussing with her what local church ministry and ministry in general is like in Canada for this time and season. Junia and AWAB's paths have crossed over the years in meaningful ways. While AWAB's history began in the United States, and welcoming and affirming ministry in American Baptist life largely grew across the continental U.S. and Alaska, in recent years, AWAB's congregational landscape has spread from the United States to Canada, the Caribbean, and across the continents of Africa and Europe, as well as to more Baptist denominational bodies. Some of you may know AWAB's mailing address is in Louisville, Kentucky. AWAB member Crescent Hill Baptist Church provides AWAB with an official office, although technically our office is an oversized closet. We share space with a large HVAC unit, but it is there where we keep stored our inventory and archives. And so, I'd like to say, after all these years, AWAB must keep coming out of the closet over and over and over again. But this is AWAB's mission, to help congregations and individuals in their coming out journeys. I'm glad today that AWAB is in touch with coming out stories of churches and people within and outside of the United States. We will hear shortly from our guest and how her work and ministry in Canada helps folk not only come out, but helps folk celebrate their coming out journeys too. Someone said, sometimes there's more spirit in a pint than there is in a pew. Would you believe the story of AWAB, or the Welcoming and Affirming movement in Baptist life, traces its roots to a bar in Lincoln, Nebraska? This story, and many more, are told in AWAB's history written by Delane Tu, Finding a Home Among Baptists. You can order your own copy of this history at awab.org/book. That is awab.org/book. This book and its rich retelling of how many Baptists are welcoming and affirming provides the basis for this current Voice of the Turtle podcast series, digging into the past while facing the present. Again, you can order your copy of Finding a Home Among Baptists at awab.org/book. It is a gift to gather in spaces like this, spaces shaped by courage, truth-telling, and the ongoing journey of becoming. For LGBTQ plus people, the coming out process is not a single moment, but a sacred unfolding, one that often requires deep bravery, resilience, and hope. It is a journey that invites each person to live more fully into who they are, even when the world has not always made that easy. And yet, it is precisely this journey that gives rise to something powerful. Pride is more than celebration. It is remembrance, resistance, and rejoicing all at once. It is the bold and beautiful declaration that who we are is not only worthy of dignity, but of joy. Pride calls each of us, LGBTQ plus people and allies alike, to stand more fully in our truth, to honor one another's stories, and to live with authenticity and courage. We also pause to recognize the progress that has been made, particularly in Canada, where hard-won strides toward LGBTQ plus inclusion and equality remind us that change is possible even as the work continues. It is in this spirit of courage, celebration, and commitment that we welcome our guest today. Reverend Junia Joplin, June to most folk, received a Bachelor of Arts from Appalachian State University and a Master of Divinity from the Baptist Theological Seminary in Richmond, Virginia. She's a past recipient of the Canada 150 Community Leader Award and was named one of Canada's top 25 women of influence in 2021. June has deep roots in Baptist life, having ministered alongside congregations in North Carolina, Virginia, and Ontario. She's also collaborated with organizations including Good Faith Media, the Baptist Peace Fellowship of North America, Baptistas por la Paz, Passport Camps, and the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. June currently serves as the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Lead for the Toronto Pride Hockey Tournament, an annual event that creates an inclusive space to support and celebrate queer women, trans athletes, and their fans. She began serving at the Metropolitan Community Church of Toronto just over 5 years ago. June, we're really grateful you've taken the time to join us today on Voice of the Turtle.
Well, thanks for having me on, Brian. It's exciting to be here with you.
And it's good to be with you. You are no stranger to AWAB. I know personally we connected not too long ago and got to spend time together when I was in Canada visiting Burlington Baptist Church. Can you share how you've known about AWAB over the years, and maybe even what you've done with AWAB, and maybe even share some of your Baptist roots?
Sure. Well, Burlington Baptist is a wonderful place, and it was good to see you there. The work that Dave and the folks down there are doing
That's
is famous or infamous, depending on which Baptist you ask here in Ontario. But they're well known for their for being inclusive. Gosh, I've been there a handful of times. And they even have some historic connection to the church that I serve, MCC Toronto, I've found out. But
Interesting.
I became aware of AWAB back when I was a seminary student, back in the early 21st century, in the early 2000s. The seminary I attended, BTSR, the late great seminary that was one of the first out of the gate after the sort of fundamentalists take over the SBC and sadly, ceased operation a couple of years ago. In the early 2000s, when I was a student, was going through, a bit of, an identity crisis, some debate about queer inclusion on its own, and in those days, I would have thought of myself as, just a good ally. I wasn't self-accepting. I wasn't out to myself in those days. So I was just a student trying to encourage faculty, fellow students, whoever would listen to me, to consider how we might become a more inclusive space.
Right.
And, I found AWAB online, I'm sure, at a conference or something like that. And you all were a really helpful resource to guide me in that allyship. And AWAB usually tabled at CBF. And I, back in the day, I was at that every year, every June or July, somewhere very hot and humid usually. And I went to my first AWAB gathering. I want to say it was a couple of years after I started pastoring in Virginia. Baptist Peace Fellowship was at Eastern Mennonite University in Harrisonburg. And I drove out and checked out BPFNA for the first time, and AWAB just happened to be meeting. And so I sat in on the meeting just as, again, a pastor who always had on the mind, like, how can I make my church more inclusive? And it was a really beautiful thing. I remember telling Robin, the executive director at the time, I got this beautiful and expansive take on the gospel that I'd never gotten before, because it felt like
from AWAB.
What's that? From AWAB?
From
Yeah,
AWAB.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Because it
Yeah.
felt like, when you grow up here and God loves you, and then you realize that,
Mm,
the people that say that have their fingers crossed behind their back, or they put an
mm,
asterisk beside it. And being around AWAB Baptists
hmm,
was really the first time in Baptist life that, that love was put out there in an unconditional way, and the
mhm.
welcome came with no strings attached. and
Yeah.
and so I've never been in a position to get deeply involved with AWAB, but
Hmm.
I've always appreciated the work that you all do.
Mm,
It's encouraging, inspiring, and
hmm.
it's great.
Wow, good. Well, we are so glad that you have connected and have been a part of AWAB in different ways over the years. Now, speaking of having connected with AWAB when you did, ministry since then has taken you from the U.S. to Canada, where you've served now for over a decade. And today you're serving Metropolitan Community Church of Toronto. How different is this from Baptist life? And what have you found the most fulfilling in your role as associate pastor there?
Yeah, well, MCC Toronto is I describe MCC Toronto as Toronto's historic and history-making queer church.
Hmm.
We are part of what is called the Universal Fellowship of Metropolitan Community Churches, or sometimes just called the Metropolitan Community Churches. And it's a global denomination made up of a lot of queer people and allies who found themselves pushed aside by other churches. One of the things I say, like when I lead a membership class at MCC Toronto, is it's very uncommon to find someone who grew up in the MCC. Most of us come from
Mm,
someplace else.
interesting.
So we have a lot of people from Baptist backgrounds.
Mm.
Usually, most of our little exiles that gather at any given Sunday are they come from Catholicism, or they
Mhm.
come from like the conservative evangelical world, and that's a lot of
Mhm.
Baptist people.
Mhm. Yeah.
When our denomination was founded back in 1968 by the Reverend Elder Troy Perry,
Mm.
Reverend Elder Perry is one of those pastors from the deep South. I think he grew up like right around the Florida Panhandle, Alabama
Interesting.
border, that area, and so he was one of those folks who grew up, I think, mostly Pentecostal, but some Baptist. And people from that part of the world were kind of understand how important those pieces of identity are. Our current senior pastor, Reverend Dina Dudley, grew up Baptist in Northern California.
Okay.
And our pastor emeritus, Reverend Brent Hawks, who was our pastor for like 40 years,
Mm.
came from Baptist life out in Atlantic Canada, which is here in Canada, that's where most of our Baptists are.
Mhm.
So there are a lot of us that still kind of carry bits and pieces of that. And,
Mm.
it shapes your identity. It shapes the way you think of how a
Mhm.
congregation works. It shapes the way that you engage with the Bible. It shapes
Mm.
your expectations of what worship looks like, and how you value preaching. As an associate pastor, my role has been a bit different, because before I transitioned into MCC life, I'd mostly worked as a senior pastor. But
Sure.
with the change of denomination, it's nice to be in that kind of second chair, and not carry the full weight of responsibilities that a senior
Mm.
pastor would carry. MCC is kind of it's more or less a congregational denomination, and what you find, which is actually really beautiful, because so many of us come from other places, we bring hopefully the best of the traditions we come from. So,
Mhm.
like I said, we've got here in a city like Toronto, where there's way more like Catholic and Orthodox and like high church Christians than there would have been in my small southern hometown. There's a lot of that, and so I've heard our Sunday morning worship service as described as Catholic mass, but make it gay, add some glitter. But then I attended a little MCC outside of Winston-Salem, North Carolina, a couple of summers ago, a couple of winters ago, and it very much had like a little kind of country community church feel,
Hmm.
because people bring the good parts of their faith, and create something that's really queer and really countercultural, and it's this beautiful mosaic.
Mhm.
There aren't many of our churches here in Canada. I think there are only two congregations right now. They tend to be in big cities around North America, and so to come from a denomination like Baptist Life, where, when I was in Richmond, Virginia, I don't know how many Baptist churches there were, but I lived about a mile from my office and drove past like 8 of them on my way to
Right.
work.
Yeah. Oh my
And so,
goodness.
we're like the only one in this
Hmm.
part of Canada. And so
Hmm.
it's just a different kind of existence, but
Yeah.
it's
Oh.
pretty wonderful. I like it. And sometimes it feels like you're in a bit of I don't know, you're in your own little world.
Hmm.
I still occasionally will see news stories about some denomination or another debating, queer inclusion. And I'll think, well, isn't
Mm.
that sweet? Like they're still having that conversation here in 2026,
Right.
whereas our denomination was literally founded on queer inclusion in 1968. So it's never been up for debate. And it's nice to know, after spending all that time in Baptist life, either thinking about how to have those
Hmm.
conversations or having those conversations or being dragged into sometimes really combative conversations, to know that that's just all settled is quite a relief, and it frees you up to do ministry in this really energetic and authentic way.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting the number of Baptist connections though that you have there at MCC Toronto. You can maybe we could say you can take a person out of a Baptist church, but you can't necessarily take the Baptist out of a person, perhaps. So, right?
It very much feels that way.
Wow. Now, I have learned from you and others that MCC of Toronto, speaking specifically of MCC Toronto, it played a major role in legalizing same-sex marriage in Canada. Can you share a bit more about this history and how has the church and you yourself witnessed LGBTQ equality evolve in Canada?
Like I said, the denomination got its start in 1968, and its first church was in the Los Angeles area. Um, a lot of the churches are turning about 50 years old right now. So within the first 5 to 10 years after the founding in 68, a lot of the churches were founded. We were founded in 1973. So if you can imagine a congregation gathered in the Stonewall era,
Mm,
the progression towards acceptance and rights has been different in each country. But the reality in the early days of MCC Toronto was, the pastor would get up in front of the congregation and say, "Now, I've been told that there are undercover police officers in the congregation today.
oh, wow.
Um, we don't know what they're here for, but we just want to say welcome, and we're not a threat."
My goodness.
Um, one of the really notable stories in the early history of the church came after what often gets described as Canada's Stonewall, which was the
Mm,
bathhouse raids in 1983.
mm,
MCC Toronto was instrumental in leading counter protests, demanding an inquiry into the police brutality that came with those raids. So that was our founding era, and we grew into a more established, larger congregation. Spent a lot of the late '80s into the early to mid to late '90s building one of the city's most significant like nonprofit ministries to people living with HIV/AIDS, because we lived through that
mm,
crisis,
sure.
and then shifted our attention towards the battle for equal marriage.
Mm,
And the way that played out is that in January of 2001, MCC Toronto conducted two weddings. There was a couple of men and a couple of women who were married on, I think it was January 14th, 2001.
wow.
The pastor at the time, Reverend Brent Hawks, in conversation with our church's legal counsel, one of the active members of the church who had been involved in a number of like queer rights type cases, suggested that there was a way that we could use the reading of the banns to conduct these weddings without needing to get the government to sign off on them.
Mm,
And it was something about the language in the law saying, when you read the banns in a church before any two persons get married, and it didn't specify the gender of those persons. So
interesting.
we we made it very clear that we were going to do this. I don't know if reading of the banns is very common in the States. I
Mm,
hadn't heard of it till I moved up here, but it's one of those ways that I guess Canadian law reflects very old English law. And you just get up in front of the church 3 Sundays in a row and say, these two people are going to get married. If anybody objects, come tell us. Otherwise, 3 weeks from now, we're doing the ceremony. And that's what happened. And it made the news, all over Canada, all over the world. It launched a legal battle that ended in the full legalization of equal marriage here in Ontario, and eventually throughout Canada. And at the time that legal decision was made, it came with the caveat that those two ceremonies conducted in January of 2001 were fully legal from the date they were conducted.
Wow.
So if you do the math, the first municipality that officially legalized equal marriage was in the Netherlands, and the first weddings were conducted in April of 2001. So at MCC Toronto, we conducted the first legally recognized same-sex marriages in modern history.
Right.
And,
wow.
Most people, I think most queer people who remember living in that era and probably know somebody who came to Canada to get married. Troy Perry, the founder of our denomination, came up to Canada and was married at MCC Toronto.
My.
And Reverend Perry likes to say, if it weren't for the work that MCC Toronto did, and if it weren't for the fight to legalize equal marriage in Canada, the United States probably wouldn't have followed suit.
Wow. Okay.
That's how impactful that was. So that's and of course that happened 25 years ago in January.
Yeah.
So you know how church life is. We finished our big Christmas celebration and then immediately said, okay, we've got another one coming in 2 weeks. And so it was huge. And back in 2001, I had absolutely no concept of all this. I was just finishing university and wasn't really paying attention to that part of the world. So to see and hear from people who are involved in that service on that day, the pastor is still our pastor emeritus. He brought in the bulletproof vest that he wore during that ceremony because there were credible threats and there was police protection and there were protesters, and lots of folks have been part of that fight, but that's a pretty significant piece of that story and one that we're pretty proud of at MCC Toronto, as you can imagine.
Absolutely, indeed. Well, what a story MCC Toronto has to tell, and how significant a part MCC Toronto's story has played in church life and in queer equality life too. We'll be right back with more of our conversation with Reverend Joplin. AWAB proudly welcomes American Baptist Home Mission Societies as a sponsor of this inaugural season of Voice of the Turtle podcast. For nearly 200 years, ABHMS has promoted the Christian faith to impact lives positively. Inspired by the gospel that heals and transforms, ABHMS cultivates and empowers faith leaders across the U.S. and Puerto Rico. ABHMS partners with American Baptists and others to build networks, foster innovation in ministry, and deliver high-quality resources to educate and equip those who are passionate about healing and transforming the communities they serve. To learn more, visit the ABHMS website at abhms.org. Thank you, ABHMS, for your support. AWAB also proudly welcomes Knollwood Baptist Church in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, as a sponsor for this inaugural season. A generous grant from Knollwood's Missions Affiliations and Allocations Committee brings Voice of the Turtle to you today. Now, back to our conversation with Reverend Joplin. You're aware, I know, of how so much, in a different kind of way, anti-LGBTQ plus sentiment is confronting people in the U.S. now, legislatively and socially. How different would you say are realities in Canada today?
Well, I think the U.S. and Canada have always been just different enough that, I don't know, we sort of play each other off on one another, or maybe it's more of a Canadian thing. There probably aren't quite as many Americans that think about Canada as often, but I think it was Pierre Trudeau, the prime minister back in the 60s, 70s, who said, who used the analogy of the sleeping elephant,
Mm.
being sharing a border with the United States is like sleeping next to an elephant, no matter what it does, you feel
Mm.
it.
Mm.
So sometimes Canadians can look at what's happening south of the border and say, "Ooh, we don't want that." And so what will often happen is if the United States makes a hard turn to the right, something reflexive will happen up here. One of the kind of frustrating things as a Canadian citizen and American citizen living in Canada is how
Right.
often Canadians will say, well, we're doing just a little bit better than the United States, and that's good
Mm.
enough for us, because it's an extremely low bar.
Mm. My.
But like, so for example, like in Canada, homosexuality was decriminalized in 1969. But as you can imagine, it's not as if like the day after that happened, queer people woke up to a new
Sure.
world,
Right.
right? So trans rights were enshrined in our Charter of Rights in 2017. So things like that we can rightly celebrate,
Mm-hmm.
but there's always progress to be made.
Mm-hmm.
The stories across history tell again and again that just because something is legalized, just because something is enshrined in law, just because some argument or battle is won, doesn't mean that the new day comes right away. And so, um, the struggles I think that queer people experience in Canada might be different in that they're not always a consequence of like an official policy. We don't have, for example, like there aren't nearly the same type of, say, like anti-trans bills being considered or debated or passed. But then, a couple of months ago, the premier of Alberta made the news for using what we call the notwithstanding clause, which is just kind of a way to circumvent the provisions of the Charter of Rights. She invoked the notwithstanding clause specifically to pull gender affirming care away from trans kids. And she had to use the notwithstanding clause because they didn't find any legal way to do it otherwise. So it was basically kind of almost like a veto type situation, not subject to like proper legislative review, just something that the chief executive of the province gets to do by fiat. So those kinds of things happen, even though discrimination might not be legal, but it still happens. I mean, this is something that a lot of equity-seeking people have experience with. I saw a report that something like 60% of LGBTQ plus people in Canada had experienced discrimination over the course of the last year. I know that here in Ontario, about half of trans people are living with unmet medical needs. I know that, for example, the government's not going to withdraw gender affirming care from
Mm-hmm.
trans people, but they're going to mess with funding for public health care and make it impossible to find a family doctor, rather, and
Mm-hmm.
that's going to have that effect. I know a lot of trans folks who are really struggling to find a doctor to put them on hormones, for example. So the challenges don't look the same,
Mm-hmm.
and I'll admit they're not as formidable, but they're
Right.
still there,
Yeah.
and they're a good reminder that progress isn't linear,
Right.
and that just because this right is enshrined, or just because this legislation has been passed, or just because this thing is policy, or this thing is in our history, it doesn't mean that everything's fixed and everything's
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
I think most of us understand how that works, but that's
Sure.
Canada has a pretty good way of Canada expresses discrimination and prejudice in more unofficial channels. That's been kind of
Mm-hmm.
what I learned.
Mm-hmm.
It's not exactly related, but when we talk about the struggle for civil rights here in Canada, we tell the story of Viola Desmond, who sat in a section of a theater in New Brunswick that wasn't marked whites only. It wasn't officially segregated. So she was arrested and charged for not paying an extra tax on the seat.
Uh,
And so the judge said, you have to wonder if this movie theater really cares about that 1 cent tax or if they're
Mm,
trying to like work around into something like Jim Crow. So
mm,
it's such that's a pretty important story for Canadian identity, but it illustrates how that prejudice and that discrimination tends to work in Canada.
yeah,
The signs aren't going to say whites only. The laws aren't going to say no gender affirming care for trans kids. But
right.
if if people with prejudice want to act on that prejudice, they find ways to do it, and that's kind of what we struggle against up here.
It is good to hear about the progress that Canada has made and makes in comparison to the US. And yet, I'm still hearing from you that, like in the US, there are still challenges and realities that those of us within the queer community and our allies still have to face.
You're talking about struggles and fights that never end, right?
Yeah, yeah,
It's there. There's always you got to take care of yourself, and you can't burn yourself out. But we all, I think, understand that there is never a point where you can just sit down and say, okay, we made it, everything is
that's right.
okay.
Yeah.
And if Canada is a little bit ahead of where the States might be,
Mhm.
that doesn't mean that we can just relax and take it easy up here.
Years ago, I attended AWAB's 20th anniversary. It took place in Providence, Rhode Island. And at one part of the celebration, there was a time where people were just sharing stories and making comments, usually words of appreciation for what AWAB meant to them over the years. And in one moment, someone stood up to share, and he said, 20 years from now, I hope that an organization like AWAB doesn't even exist. And he said it in a good way, and he meant it really well. And yet, as he said that, I sat there and I thought to myself, you know what? I'm afraid 20 years from now, an organization like AWAB is still going to be needed. And isn't that the truth? Organizations like AWAB and the Baptists aren't the only organization that has a welcoming and affirming organization, right? Most church denominations, church bodies have like organizations, and each of us continue to have work to do. And I know that this work too also is work that can't be done alone or in isolation. And this work, I think, too, reminds us often that there is always something for all of us to do. In our last Voice of the Turtle episode, Paul Rauschenbusch reminded us of this. He talked about courage when feeling overwhelmed about realities, and especially in the face of governmental dynamics and challenges. He reminded us about courage and how courage is contagious. I'm wondering, thinking about what MCC Toronto still has to celebrate this year. Pride Month is coming up. And so MCC of Toronto will courageously, I suspect, give witness to the ongoing work of equality that it's been about and that needs to be done. How will MCC Toronto celebrate Pride this year?
Well, it's good that you're asking that because like the last thing I did this morning before I got on with you all was I had a Pride planning meeting. We
Oh
have
my,
those
there we
every
go.
Thursday now,
Okay,
and
good.
as soon as the calendar turns past Easter, it's Pride season, which is at MCC Toronto. It's big a season as Christmas or Easter,
Mm,
just about.
good.
Well, Toronto Pride brings millions of people into the city. It's always really wonderful. I think we were the venue for World Pride back in I want to say 2018 or 2019, and I would give out an invitation if you ever want to come up to Toronto Pride. It's absolutely wonderful, and the weather's really nice.
Good to know.
We were one of the first organizations to march in Toronto Pride back in its earliest days, and for a long time we owned what was the biggest pride flag in the world. I don't think it's the
Oh my
biggest anymore, but it's
goodness.
still pretty big. And so we need
MCC
about
Toronto owned the biggest pride flag?
that's what I'm told. And
Okay.
it's 200 something feet long.
Oh
I
my
don't know. It
goodness.
takes about 70
Wow.
or 80 people to carry it. So
Wow.
we're always looking for volunteers to help us carry that in the parade. We do a worship service, either out on the street if we can get a venue, or at a venue near the Toronto Pride Festival footprint, and we call it Church on Church because if you're outside the area, it doesn't translate as much, but the sort of the big historic gayborhood in Toronto is on Church Street. So we call it Church on Church, and we have a service, and it's just a huge celebration of spirituality and queerness and how powerful those things are when they're together. So, we're talking about getting parade volunteers. We're talking about planning the service. We're talking about connecting to people through the street fair. It's a lot of fun. It's busy, but it's a lot of fun. This year, we're actually doing something with other faith leaders to celebrate 25 years of marriage equality.
Wonderful.
And we're going to do, I think, on the Sunday morning of Pride, a breakfast and a renewal of vow ceremony with clergy from multiple faiths.
Mm-hmm.
We have a rabbi, we have like Hindu clergy, Muslim clergy, we have First Nations spiritual leaders, and we're going to do this really beautiful affirmation celebrating 25 years of marriage equality.
Wow. So is this an open invitation to anyone listening? Can they come and join MCC Toronto and help carry?
Come on up. It's the 28th of June.
Wow.
That morning, just before Toronto's Pride Parade, which is one of the biggest pride parades in North America, at this concert hall where the Rolling Stones used to practice, just off the parade route, we will have a big worship service with some of the best music you've ever heard.
Church on Church.
Yeah, Church on Church. It's going to be wonderful, and it's one of our signature ways to celebrate the Pride season at MCC Toronto.
Good. Well, for those of you who are listening, know that you have officially been invited to join MCC Toronto, June 28th, Church on Church. And there may even be a task for you to do. So wonderful. Wow. Well, June, thank you so much for being with us. We are grateful for your witness and for your courage in so many ways. Thank you for the courage that you took to come out, and for now how you help so many others through your ministry on their own coming out journeys. It's been so good to be with you for this episode of Voice of the Turtle. Now, you may know this, but Voice of the Turtle was the name of an LGBTQ plus newsletter produced by Baptists beginning in the early 70s. It was a precursor to AWAB's current newsletter, The Welcoming Spirit, the TWS. Voice of the Turtle's motto was, "Behold the turtle, it makes progress only when it sticks out its neck." How would you encourage folk today, and maybe even in the present time, to stick out their neck? We ask each interviewee this same question.
Well, this is something I said to our congregation a couple of weeks ago, because just at the end of March, on the 31st is the International Transgender Day of Visibility. And every year that date comes, and it comes with complexity, because visibility can be quite dangerous for trans folks. It can bring scrutiny. It can bring even violence. It can bring a lot of unwanted attention. So one of the things I always say as Trans Day of Visibility comes and goes is that we need the help of cis allies. We need folks who will speak up on our behalf. We need folks who will come to our defense. As much attention as trans people get in the media, as often as transphobic people like to bring us up and talk about us, the population of trans people isn't really that big. And so we rely on committed allies to help us, to help protect us, to help advocate for us, to stand up for us. And without that, visibility is a lot more dangerous. So I'm always encouraging cis people to be there and to protect and to stand up for your trans siblings.
AWAB is grateful for you, June, and for the ways in which you continue to stick out your own neck for so many. Thank you for sharing your perspective and wisdom, for giving us some history, and sharing too some of your own passion and the courage with which you do what you do every day. So thank you.
Thanks, Brian. It's been so good to be with you today.
Please plan to join us for our next Voice of the Turtle episode, when we visit with Dr. Susan Shaw, Professor Emerita of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Oregon State University. Susan was also AWAB's 2023 lecturer for its annual lecture series. We will revisit with Dr. Shaw Truths and Lies at the Foot of the Cross, the topic of her 2023 lecture. That's all the dirt for this episode of Digging into the Past while Facing the Present, Season 1 of the podcast from the Association of Welcoming and Affirming Baptists, AWAB. The podcast is produced by our friends at Good Faith Media. Learn more at goodfaithmedia.org. Our music comes from Pond 5. This AWAB podcast is made possible by a generous grant from American Baptist Home Mission Societies and from Knollwood Baptist Church in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. You can learn more about us, AWAB, at awab.org. You can tap more of our free resources, including a list of fully welcoming and affirming Baptist-aligned churches in the United States and elsewhere. That's awab.org. Reach out. You can support us, and we can support you. Check out the show notes for more information. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast, give us a like and rating, and tell your friends about it. If you find yourself needing immediate support and someone to talk to, please don't hesitate to call or text 988, the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. Call or text 988. I'm Brian Henderson. Stay encouraged. Remember, you are not alone.